Welcome, everybody. This is the 2023 Bible and Beyond discussions, and I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Paul Anderson. He is a professor of biblical and Quaker studies at George Fox University, and I learned about Paul's passionate and fascinating work on the Gospel of John at a conference of the John, Jesus, and History Project. He was a founding member of this project, and he brings us a wealth of knowledge and experience. He is New Testament editor for the Biblical Interpretation series for Brill and co-editor of the Johannine monograph series for Whitman-Stock. He's written, hundreds of essays and makes presentations all over the world, serving also as extraordinary professor of religion at the Northwest University of Potchefstroom, I hope I said that right, in South Africa. One of his books, The Riddles of the Fourth Gospel, is especially pertinent to our conversation this evening. You might want to check that out too. Our textual study this evening is titled, Why the Gospel of John is Such a Surprise. The Gospel of John has been overlooked in the historical search for Jesus. Surprisingly, this gospel is a more valuable resource than most scholars have admitted recently, and we'll discuss some of the reasons for the reluctance associated with the Gospel of John. Before we get into our discussion tonight, I want you to be aware that our new course, The Secret Revelation of John, which is not the same thing as the Gospel of John, is being made available in a number of venues. To be clear, this is not the same as the biblical book, the Revelation to John, but this secret revelation of John adds so much to our rich understanding of the early Jesus followers. Anyway, time to welcome Paul. Glad you're here with us, Paul.
Hey, thank you, Shirley. Great to be with you.
So tonight is our kickoff event for our 2-month focus on surprising things about Jesus. That means that on early Christian texts, we'll have 2 Bible and Beyond discussions. This is the first one, 2 podcasts, 6 blog posts, and 2 newsletters devoted to the surprising things about Jesus. So, Paul, you're the first one to talk to us about this. And my guess is that most people who are here with us tonight and those watching the video after the fact are with us because they are interested in Jesus and want to know what else there is to know about Jesus. So you surprised me by claiming that we can find something surprising in one of the canonical Gospels. It seems to me that for millennia, people have been reading the Gospels in the Bible as their primary source for learning about Jesus, but you're claiming that there's something right in front of our faces that we may not have even noticed from the Gospel of John. I expect most people are eager for you to tell us just the facts. So, do you know what color his hair was? Or do you know who his immediate family was? Or can you tell us who the beloved disciple was? We're hungry for these facts. But maybe you can actually start us off by helping us know how scholars even find history in the Bible. So go ahead, Paul, it's up to you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Shirley. The Gospel of John has been a favorite across the last 2 millennia, of course. In the 2nd century, it was probably the most often cited of early Christianity texts, and people saw it as being written by John the theologian. Of course, that raises a question right off the bat. If something is theological, how can it be historical? Or how does perhaps a theological interest perhaps corrupt objectivity? Nonetheless, the Gospel of John especially played roles in the first 4, especially ecumenical councils of early Christianity, from 325 up to 451. You have both sides of theological debates, Christological debates, citing the Gospel of John. So the humanity of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, equal to the Father, subordinate to the Father, Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father, proceeding from the Son. You have both sides of these polar issues being included in the Gospel of John. So surely...
For just 1 second, could you help us with the word Christological? I'm not sure that everybody knows that word.
It's just pertaining to Christ. So theological is pertaining to God. Logos, the study of, like biology, the study of bios, life. So Christology is the study of Christ.
Okay, very good.
So the Gospel of John, and this is what intrigued me first about getting into doctoral work on the Gospel of John. I was taking a course in seminary on the Gospel of John at Earlham School of Religion. Alan Culp, my professor, I just graduated from Harvard, working with George McCrae and Helmut Kester and others. And so I'm learning about the Gospel of John, but then that same professor taught a course in early church history. And there we're looking at, again, these first four councils. And it just struck me that both sides of the debates are citing the Gospel of John. So that piqued my interest in terms of what to do a doctoral dissertation on. So I ended up studying at Glasgow with John Riches, who's one of Bultmann's translators, his commentary on John. But Riches was also, and is also, a historical Jesus scholar. So did my doctoral dissertation on the Christology of the fourth gospel and looked at its unity and disunity. So what are the tensions? What are their origins? And I used John 6 as a case study. Well, in my work, I realized it's not just theological tensions or riddles, but you have historical problems and riddles and literary problems and riddles. So the referenced riddles of the fourth gospel, I've limited myself to 3 dozen riddles, a dozen historical and literary riddles. These are problems pertaining to the Gospel of John. And therefore, you can understand why good scholars, even top scholars around the world, might disagree with each other on any one of these 36 riddles. And there are more than the 36. So basically, so having worked on the Christology or the theology of John, I'm forced to face the fact that you have a lot of historical stuff in John also. A lot of it is mundane. A lot of it is a reference to archaeological or topographical facts. And yet the Gospel of John, for the last 150 years since F.C. Bauer, has been excluded from historical Jesus research. Now, we can get into that a little bit later on, but that's what led me to think, well, we can understand why John is a problem. John is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yeah. Okay. So we'll call those Gospels the synoptic Gospels, okay. Meaning similar optic perspective. Well, the reason for that mainly is that Matthew and Luke are built upon Mark. They're using Mark. But then again, the material particular to Matthew and particular to Luke also corroborates the stuff that's in Mark. And so critical scholars for the last 150 years have tried to be reductionistic or tried to be academically conservative. Let's not make any mistakes any more than we need to. And sometimes we need to. Just kidding. But okay, if we're trying to develop like secure stepping stones for understanding Jesus, let's just use Matthew, Mark, and Luke and not include John. So that's been kind of a conservative approach among scholars for the last, I'd say, the first 3 quests for Jesus. So if we use John, my goodness, that's going to require a new quest.
Right. So maybe you can help us also think a little bit about these Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics that you're talking about. Can you give us an overview of how we should think about their difference from John? Like, did these authors know each other? Did they write their stories without knowing each other? Tell us a little bit about them so we can compare what you're talking about with John.
These are great questions also. Clearly, Mark is probably the first gospel to be circulated, maybe around 70 or so after the death of Peter. The traditional view is that John Mark, a helper of Paul, hears Peter's preaching in Rome or someplace, and he preserves it in written form. So the Gospel of Mark is probably circulating, maybe it's even performed among the churches, probably around 70 AD after the death of Peter. And clearly Matthew uses Mark. That's the most secure of intergospel relationships. 90% of Mark is almost word for word in Matthew. Now, Matthew adds a lot of material also, which also has some historical and also contextual content to it, but Matthew uses Mark. Luke also has about 60% of Mark. And so Luke uses Mark also. Now, here's another question. What do you do with the material that's common to Luke and Matthew, but not in Mark? Scholars have thought maybe it's Q or Quella, that's German word for source or fountain. About 230 verses are common to this double tradition, but not Mark. Okay, so maybe we have a source that we're not aware of. Another explanation that's been coming up in the last few years, Mark Goodacre at Duke is putting this forward. Well, what if Luke has access to Matthew as well as Mark? So if Luke has access to Mark, or if Matthew has access to Luke, we might not need Q. So anyway, that Mark being the source of Matthew and Luke is the most secure. Now, the question becomes then, did John know of any of these, or did any of these know John?
Right.
Let me just kind of focus that a little bit. Is the author of John familiar at least with Mark? I think most scholars are saying yes, at least familiar. Some scholars say, well, John depended on Mark. Well, every time John is similar to Mark, it's also different, okay? So I don't think that John is dependent on Mark. Also, 85% of John is not in the synoptics. So where did that come from? So I go with the view of a scholar in Australia, Kim, who is saying that Mark, John heard Mark performed among the churches, okay. And maybe in hearing Mark performed, he wrote an augmentation. So here's some early material and some Judean material. So maybe augments Mark chronologically and geographically. To me, that makes sense. I might even see 2 editions of John, so the later material might harmonize with Mark.
That's really helpful to give us a feel for how they're interrelated and why John is rather different. But maybe you could also help us at this point to understand why would we then turn, I think you started to say this in the beginning, but let's just go back over this. Why would we turn then to Matthew, Mark, and Luke for historical facts about Jesus as opposed to John? Why would that happen?
Okay, well, here's some ways. So even though I'm working on historical Jesus informed by John, right. I think in a lot of ways, the synoptics are more historical than John. For instance, true or false, Jesus spoke in parables in his teachings about the kingdom of God. I think most would say, yes, he did that. Problem, right. John has no parables.
Oops. Okay.
Sayings, okay. Now, true or false, if we had extended I am discourses spoken by historical Jesus, why are they only in John? Why aren't they included in the other gospels? So I think we have to see those as maybe the fourth evangelist, whoever he is, expanding on this, or it's maybe part of his teachings about Jesus. So it's maybe paraphrased. Now, here's another fact. The I am sayings, all 9 of the metaphors or themes, all 9 of those are also in the mouth of the synoptic Jesus. Okay.
Wait, back up a little bit. You're saying I am, you mean when Jesus says I am something? Is that what you're referring to?
I am the bread of life. I am the word. I am the word who's been alive. So in Matthew, you have Jesus saying, you are the light of the world. You have light of the world. But in John, it's I am the light of the world. So one cannot say on the basis of synoptics, Jesus never said light of the world. What you have, okay, and also shepherd. You've got this Q parable in Matthew and Luke where you have the shepherd going and searching for the sheep. Well, in John, Jesus is the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. And by the way, I'm the gate also, you see. And so, so you've got similar themes, but I'm willing to guess that probably we have the evangelist morphing it into his understanding of Jesus. So I might call that paraphrases of Jesus' tradition or the sayings of Jesus, because that's the way the guy is preaching the material, okay? And so is that kind of interpreted history that you have in John. Here's another one, true or false. Jesus performed exorcisms. Well, Jesus scholars would say, yeah, he probably did some of that. There were exorcists back then. Problem, John has no exorcists, no exorcisms. Right. Oh, how historical is that? I mean, John excludes stuff. Well, then again, when you look at Mark, you have one of the disciples saying, and also Luke, saying, should we silence the people who are casting out demons in your name? And Jesus says, no, let them keep going. If they're not against us, they're for us.
Okay.
Now, raising that question is John the Apostle. Yeah, maybe someone who is packaging the Johannine tradition, maybe he's uncomfortable with exorcisms for whatever reason, or maybe they're just not that relevant there in Asia Minor. Or how about this? What if the author of John, again, whoever he was, what if he knows of Mark and wants to be non-duplicative? That's already out there. And so silence or absence is never a proof of anything. How do you know that it's known? No, you can't really say it's omitted. You can just only say that it's not there. That doesn't mean that it was known and chosen not to be included. So we have to be modest in the inferences that we make. How about this? When Jesus goes to Jerusalem, then he, at the end of his ministry, and he does this temple demonstration. Whoa, what a great reason to kill him. So,
Okay.
now, John, the temple incident, if it was the same event, is at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see how scholars might guess, well, man, I mean, that would sure be a reason to hang up Jesus because he did this terrible thing. Well, okay, so those are reasons for including the synoptic Jesus as historical, and John must be theological.
Okay.
Well,
That's helpful.
well, let me slice it the other way. True or false? Jesus ministered for only 1 year. Well,
it's got to be false.
well, that's 3 Passovers. And the synoptics, it's only 1 Passover. Okay. Although Mark has 2 springtimes. There's green grass at the feeding, and then you have the Passover later. Okay. But only 1 Passover. True or false? Jesus went to Jerusalem only 1 time during his ministry. And when he did, they killed him. Well, John has 4 visits to Jerusalem. So that would be more plausible from just an objective historical basis. True or false? When Jesus heals the man in John 5 in Jerusalem, who is a lame person, they want to kill him. Well, that seems rather abrupt. I mean, yeah, he's violating Sabbath and stuff. Oh, well, maybe that would suggest that Jesus had been to Jerusalem earlier and that he did a temple demonstration, and so early on they're wanting to kill Jesus. So that might suggest the realism of John over and against the synoptics. Now, of course, there are other problems too. The raising of Lazarus, that's only in John. If Jesus really raised Lazarus or someone who's been in the tomb 4 days, lo, he stinketh, says the King James.
Okay.
Something like that. How could it not be known by other gospel traditions? If they would have known it, they would have included it. And therefore, it must not have happened. Or at least you can see how scholars might make those kinds of guesses. Then again, how do we know that Mark, if Mark is the source of Mark, how do we know that he heard all of Peter's preaching? How do we know that Peter preached everything that he had heard? How do we know that Peter, or whoever's the source of Mark, how do we know that Peter was there for that Bethany visit? Maybe he was on a fishing trip. So again, reason for explaining absence of material as saying, therefore, we know the synoptics are historical. John is not historical. Well, now wait a minute. We have to be more modest and reticent in terms of the claims of ahistoricity that we make based upon these gospel differences.
That's really helpful to see why we don't have any definitive answers about anything. Great job, Paul. Next question you could clear up for us. You kept referring to John, whoever he was. So, can you tell us anything about John? Did John, the son of Zebedee, or Jesus' disciple, write the gospel? Or if not him, then how close to the facts would the real author have been? And where would he have gotten his information then? Tell us about the John person here.
Yeah. Well, Johannine authorship has been one of the most embattled subjects in the entirety of biblical studies.
Okay.
And so you have all of these problems. If John is written by an eyewitness, why is it so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
Yeah.
Let me raise another question. You have the juxtaposition of the beloved disciple and Peter. Yeah. And the Bible gets it right, Peter gets it wrong. So even my hero and friend, Raymond Brown, who died, over 30 years or just about 27 years ago, he speculated, he went along with Kuhlmann, who say, well, therefore, if you have the denigration of Peter, or at least his juxtaposition, therefore, maybe the author was an eyewitness, but not one of the 12, okay? Because we know the 12 would never disagree with each other. I don't know about you guys, but I've been on an academic staff with friends or a church staff. Sometimes good friends disagree with each other, okay? Yes. I'm not bothered one bit by even rivalry or inferred rivalry between two apostles. That to me is realism. How about this? You have the martyrdom of Peter predicted in John 21. People are going to take you and they're going to rush you off, and you won't have anything to say about your being killed. That's kind of predicting something that has probably already happened by the time John 21 is finished. But you have also the prediction of the martyrdom of James and John in Mark 10. Are you willing to drink my cup and be baptized with my baptism? We are, shall be. And so you have Jesus predicting their martyrdoms. You have Aramaic nicknames, Cephas, for Peter in John 1. And you have Boanerges, Boanerges, for James and John, sons of thunder. So I mean, it seems like the author of John is presented as being a friend of Peter. And if Peter's employee is Zebedee, John's father, well, that would cohere. I mean, that would make sense. But here are but these other problems that I mentioned, like no parables, no kingdom of God sayings, except for two references, one kingdom of God in John 3 and John 20 or John 18. You have these problems. Oh, and also here's another problem. The Gospel of John begins with the Christ hymn. It's a cosmological perspective. In the beginning was the Word is the Word, God was, the Word was God. Whoa. How could that be written by an eyewitness? That clearly seems to be a confessional hymnic kind of a fragment. And therefore, that's not what an eyewitness would come up with. That's what a community is confessing later. Now, I might agree with that. And I might, in fact, I'm presenting a paper on this at Society of New Testament Studies in Austria this summer. I'm arguing that the Christ hymn was not a part of the first edition of the Gospel of John. Okay. I'm arguing like 1 John 1:1-3, first epistle, what we've seen and heard from the beginning, we proclaim to you the word of life. It's more similar to the beginning of 1 John. So I might see the author of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the epistles, who is John the Elder, I might see him as the final editor of the gospel after the death of the beloved disciple. So in John 21, Jesus never said that he would not die. He said to Peter, what's it to you if he lives till I come again? So I think that whoever the evangelist was, gospel writer, the fourth evangelist, we'll call him whoever he was, or her, but probably him, whoever he was, it appears that he has died by the time the work is finalized. So I'll see John the Elder as finalizing the work of the fourth evangelist. Mm-hmm. Now I came up, okay, so real scholars, though, will say that conservative traditionalists have corrupted our understanding of history. And so they're skeptical about anything that's traditional and call this with some bravado a hermeneutic of suspicion. Well, I mean, I ask them, so are you suspicious of your own hermeneutic? And if you're not, I am. Or if you're not, you're a hypocrite. Anyway, so just because it's traditional, it doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, show me you know a better alternative theory. Show me you know that. If you don't have an alternative, then you might question it. That's different from saying you've overturned it. So let me just raise an issue that has come up since 1888, and that was a long time ago. In 1888, a scholar named Karl de Boer, who is Dutch, wrote an essay on the early death of John. And what he argues is that in the 5th century and the 9th century, two church leaders described the early death of John the Apostle. So if he died early, he could not have written the gospel according to John. Okay. But I made the mistake of looking up what they said.
Uh-oh.
And first of all, they don't say that. Now, what they say is James and John suffered martyrdom. Now, James, the brother of Jesus, died in 44 AD. So if John died at the same time, that would be his death at 44. Okay, so that's the overall idea. Now, Philip of Sides, Philip Sidetes, and George Hamartalos, George the Sinner, these are the two figures. They don't say they died at the same time. They just say they suffered martyrdom. Okay? So they do not say they died at the same time. Second, they are simply repeating a church holiday. And so you have the martyrdom of James and John celebrated among the churches on the same Sunday. Okay? And so it's a holiday reminiscence. It's not a historical statement. It's based on Mark 10, 38, 39. Are you going to drink my cup, do outside baptism? But then third, when I read what else they wrote, they both follow Eusebius in saying that John the Apostle died in Ephesus after Domitian. Domitian died in 96 AD. Okay. So that would place John's death around 98 or so, into the reign of Trajan, who becomes emperor in 98. So that as a reason for saying there's no way John could be written by John the Apostle, because early church fathers gave us a hint that he died early. Now, that's what critical scholars have come up with. You have to learn that. It's going to be on the exam. If you don't believe that, and go back to Sunday school. I mean, that's the kind of, hegemony that critical scholars put out there. I mean, we're all trying to do as well as we can, okay?
Right.
But the point is, they never said that, okay? And so I'm also presenting a paper on that at South Africa, at the International Society of Biblical Literature meetings in Pretoria, South Africa, on the early death that never was. I think it's an embarrassment to critical scholarship. Show me you don't know that. You can't claim it. You might raise it as a question, but it can't be a claim.
Wow. So, Paul, I have to say that in the next half hour, we open it up for conversation with everybody else. So I'm going to just ask you one more question before we open it up to everybody else to ask questions. My last question is, tell us then a surprise about the Gospel of John. What is it about the Gospel of John that surprises us?
Well, in the Gospel of John, I think the value of including it in the historical quest for Jesus. So I'll call this the fourth quest. I think we have to come up with new criteria for determining historicity if we're going to include everything. And so we can't just include Gnostic texts. We need to include also the Gospel of John. So I was involved with Marcus Borg in 2010 with a set of public dialogues here in Portland, Oregon. I call it Jesus in bioptic perspective. Synoptics and John as the bioptic Gospels. And so after our first presentations, Marcus said to me, so Paul, why are you doing this John Jesus history project? I mean, what would come of this? Is it just that Jesus took several trips to Jerusalem, or is there anything weighty that could come out of this? And here's my response. I said, wow, Marcus, thank you for, I said, what if John is the only gospel written by an eyewitness? What difference would that make? And I said, wow, that's a great question. And I said, first of all, I don't care. I don't care what people come up with. I just think it's an underused resource. But as I think about it, there are a couple of issues that might be helpful for understanding Jesus of Nazareth. First of all, he includes women in his relationships. The woman at the well is the apostle to the Samaritans. Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostles. I think that's significant. Further, I think it pushes back against rising male leadership in the late first century situation, pushing back against Ignatian hierarchy and monoepiscopal, church hierarchy. And the second thing I think is significant is that we have a familial, egalitarian view of the church. And that seems to be closer to a more primitive understanding of Jesus as a charismatic leader, along with, his followers. I think that's closer to the historical Jesus than later, more hierarchical structures.
Wow, that's enough to make me want to learn about what John is saying. I really appreciate that. All right, so here's what we're going to do now. be thinking of your own questions, because this is how we turn it over to the rest of you to ask your questions. You get to be in the interview chair now. So if you'll just raise your hand, I'm going to be watching for hands coming up, and I'll call on you to ask a question. And Paul, you can see we have like 40 some odd people here. So kind of keep your answers short enough that a lot of people can talk to you. So we'll see where we can go with this. All right, Helen's already ready. Go ahead, Helen. What do you want to say?
Okay. I taught the Gospel of John at a college level, and I also taught it to a bunch of Presbyterians for a whole year and only got through the chapter 11. It is so rich in terms of rhetorical, the way it's done rhetorically. But I was kind of doubtful about your idea that the epistles of John were a later sort of editor to the Gospel of John, because the epistles of John have a very different theological position. You've got the current, everything is now in the Gospel of John, where in the epistles of John, they really are expecting end times, I think. So that was one question. And then I also read, I got a lot of questions, so I'll just shut down.
Go ahead with that, Paul.
Yeah, I do think we have two different authors, the gospel writer and the author of the epistles. You also have the gospel writer being more dialectical, both and. The author of the epistles is either or. Judith Liu had that idea that I think is probably arguable. So now according to tradition, there are two people named John at Ephesus. Papias says they are buried here. They're sleeping in Ephesus. And if you ever go to Ephesus, everybody should go there. There's a huge church of St. John. That's a 6th century, huge edifice that's built on an earlier church. So in church memory, there's the memory of John the Apostle and John the Elder. Now, Elder is younger.
Beloved disciple was never named John. There's not that connection with John at all that I remember.
Well, it certainly is connected in the 2nd century literature.
Right.
People are connecting that John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, that connection is pretty unanimous in all 2nd century literature. Now, but Helen, you've raised a question. If John the Apostle is connected with its authorship, why is John's name never mentioned? Only the beloved disciple. Now you do have in 21:2 the sons or those of Zebedee.
That's a later addition to the gospel, from what I understand too. Chapter.
I think it's added later. So I think that we have a first edition local around 80 or 85 as the second gospel. And I think the beloved disciple keeps preaching. And I think that after his death, the author of the epistles, after writing, John the Elder, after writing the epistles, 80, 85, 85, 90, 95, then he finalized the gospel around 100. I think he adds chapter 21. He adds the Christ hymn. Maybe he adds John 6, the feeding of the 5,000, and then chapters 15, 16, 17. So let us depart, 1431. They get to the garden, 18. So you have later material, I think, added to an earlier edition. Now, Helen, one little clue that I came up with that nobody had seen before kind of blew me away. So Shirley, here's something really surprising.
All right, tell us.
I'm just looking up everything, okay? So everything on Peter, everything on John. And in Acts 4, 19 and 20, look it up. Peter and John speak. But it's two statements, not one. The first statement is we must obey God rather than man. And then Peter in 5:29, 11:17 says God rather than man. So a Petrine cliche. But the next statement, what we have seen and heard, my goodness, that's a Johannine cliche. And it's only echoed in 1 John 1:3. And so here we have John the Apostle, who is presented in Luke Acts, a full century before Irenaeus, as associating John the Apostle with a Johannine cliche, and that approximates a fact. So I'm willing to see John the Apostle as not being excluded from Johannine Christianity. I think that attempts to push John the Apostle out of that picture are simply motivated by the fact that the Gospel of John is different.
I think it's also, and this will be the last thing I say, is that it's really not about apostleship in the Gospel of John. It's about disciples. And even the very first chapter where they list all the disciples, it's about who, and there are people there that are not part of the 12. And so the place where the apostles are actually mentioned, or I think one or two places, it's traditional material. So I don't get a sense that I almost see the Gospel of John as in dialogue, or let's say the author of John saying, let's sit down at the table with this apostolic community because we have something to say too, and that they're in conversation. That's that Peter and the beloved tension there that you mentioned so nicely. So that's just, and I might be the old guard. I was trained 20 years ago, so.
Not alone.
But still, I think what you're saying is fascinating. Thank you so much.
And the view that John the Elder is the author of the gospel, that's held by Richard Bauckham, by Martin Hengel. But both Bauckham and Hengel are going with the early death of John as the basis for that. And so these are my friends, and I think they're wrong on that basis.
Great. Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Paul. It was fascinating to listen to. And if anybody else has any questions, raise your hand. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you something else until I see more hands. I was wondering, Paul, if you could sort of be more specific and give us examples of how John contributes to the historical studies of Jesus. I can see we have 3 more hands, though, so you got to make this quick. Can you tell us just a couple of examples of how John contributes to the historical studies of Jesus?
Yeah, I think, first of all, if the author of John, I'll just call him John. If John's familiar with Mark, then we have additional material.
Okay.
And miracle number 1. Okay, so the first edition of John has only 5 miracles, not 8 miracles. And these are the 5 miracles that are not in Mark. So number 1 and number 2, this is before Mark 1. Miracles in Jerusalem and Bethany, these are chronological augmentations of Mark. So I think that John is intentionally trying to augment Mark and include some other stuff. I think that John is also correcting Mark. How about this? Jesus never said this disciple would not die. He said to him, what is due for this till I come again? Maybe Mark 9:1, the transfiguration, there are people standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in all of his glory. And so even in the Pauline and Petrine traditions, you have hope that Christ is going to return before the eyewitnesses die. Well, you have here a statement that Jesus never said that. Peter got it wrong from day 1.
Okay.
Push back against Peter. Bonehead over there. I mean, we had discussions about this, and Bonehead, I mean, he got some things right, but in some things he was wrong. So to me, I think that represents debates among the apostles, not non-apostolic versus apostolicity.
Okay, that's interesting. I have more questions, but we're going to go to Carla. Carla, you're up. What's your question?
Hello. By the way, Paul, I'm another Portlander.
Oh, hi, Carla.
I like the George Fox billboards. I had to tell you that.
Oh,
George Fox is the best billboards around the city. Mine is a very simple question. Maybe everybody else knows it, but you talked about 3 or 4 quests for Jesus.
Yeah.
What are those?
So the first quest will be 19th century quests. And you have, especially in Germany and elsewhere, trying to find out who the historical Jesus is. You have David Strauss arguing that it comes from mythology. And so, again, you have a pushback against anything miraculous because in the modern era, we know that no miracles can ever happen. Well, that's kind of overstated. I mean, goodness, there were healers back then. Okay, sometimes, waves do calm down. You never know. But kind of, saying that it comes from fairy tale. It comes from folklore. That's where it came from. And you have form critical methodologies developed by Bultmann and others showing how stories came together, underlying synoptics, underlying John. Well, Albert Schweitzer, in building on the work of William Vrede with a W, who says, well, if Mark is the first gospel, Mark's also theological, not historical. So you have the messianic secret in Mark. Jesus said, don't tell anybody. Well, is that historical, or is that just making up an excuse for why the movement wasn't as famous as it could have been? Okay. So Vrede says Mark is not historical. So Schweitzer in 1906, The Quest of Historical Jesus, says there's nothing we can know about historical Jesus. So the first quest is followed then in Germany by giving up on the historical quest, although the quest continues in Britain and in the United States and elsewhere. The second quest, or what James Robinson calls the new quest, happens in 1953 and 54, when Ernst Käsemann presents to the Marburg students of Bultmann, saying, we really have to look at historical Jesus. Okay, I mean, Jesus was a Jew. Look at the Holocaust. We have to remember Jesus was a Jew. Okay, that's important. And what Käsemann did, though, because his view is that John is not historical at all, it's totally docetic. It's naive docetism. The feet of the Johannine Jesus don't even touch the ground. He knows what's going to happen to him. He floats, and they can't arrest him. That's Käsemann's view about Jesus and John. So Käsemann develops criteria for determining historicity that exclude John, and that's the new quest. Now, the Jesus Seminar really built on that, and John Dominic Crossan has said, well, yeah, the Jesus Seminar is the renewed quest, getting back to a parsimonious, reductionistic, conservative, make no mistakes quest for Jesus. The third quest in 1980 was described by N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, saying, people are using some new methodologies, social sciences. So the third quest is using new methodologies, but to be conservative or not make mistakes, third questers often have also left John out. So the fourth quest is finding a way to use John.
Well done. That was quick. You did a good job with that one. And thanks for that great question, Carla. That was a good one to ask. And DJAA iPad, I don't know who you are, but it's your turn to ask a question.
Okay, it's me from Scottsdale, Diana Austin. I had read two books by Gail R. O'Day.
Yeah.
And she was a professor assistant. She was a professor at the Chandler School of Theology at Emory, and she also taught in St. Louis, and et cetera. And she had noticed that her students were afraid to deal with John, except around the crucifixion. So she basically put together two books based on how to deal with the various stories in John. And I thought, to me, it was like, my gut feeling is John is like, it's for those who really want to get down to the nitty gritty, versus the other Gospels are for the generic people who, want to be a Christian, but are not really into doing all what is absolutely necessary to really follow. I mean, that's my gut instinct, and maybe I'm wrong.
Yes. Gail O'Day was a very good friend of mine. In fact, I published all of her Johannine essays, adding them to the book you showed, Revelation of the Fourth Gospel.
Yeah, there's both of them. Yeah. The Word Disclosed and Revelation of the Fourth Gospel.
He's going to go get his book.
Oh, okay. Anyway, I got them both. They're really good. I like them.
She also did the commentary on the New Interpreter's Bible for the Gospel of John. She's an amazing rhetorical scholar.
Right. And here's her book of essays that I published a couple of years ago.
Okay. I'll be looking that up. Thank you.
Yeah. So Gail has done a wonderful job, along with Alan Culpepper, at saying, hey, folks, who knows about history or theology? Let's just look at literary unity. And so Gail has put forward literary analyses of John's material. And the whole thing is about revelation. How does God speak to us through the text? And so that's the way that she has worked. And so Gail really left historical questions off the table and just worked on literary unity of John's texts.
Very helpful. Thank you. And Peggy, tell us what you're thinking about.
I'm just representing the chat room.
Okay.
And I want to let you know that there's links to Paul's books in the chat, but there's also a question from Joan. What clues in Mark would make scholars think it was written first, around 70 AD? Why not Matthew or Luke? And someone else added a question after that. So,
yeah, that's a great question. And Matthean priority lasted for about 1,600 years. Augustine argued Matthean priority. and therefore Mark was totally excluded. But if you think about, I mean, most of Mark is already in Matthew, so who needs it? Okay. But when you ask the question, why would Mark leave out the Lord's Prayer, the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest parables? Mark is rougher than Matthew. It's really difficult to imagine that Matthew is an improvement, or that Mark is an improvement upon Matthew. Much easier to imagine that Matthew is an improvement upon Mark, and Matthew adds stuff to Mark. I think a compelling issue, though, is that Papias cites the elder. Now, this is the John the Elder, okay? He cites the elder's opinion about Mark, and he has 3 comments that are critical, but also maybe complementary. The first statement is that Mark is pretty good, or that Mark contains the preaching of Peter, okay? But it's in the wrong order. It's pretty good, but it's in the wrong order. So that might suggest, or I think that reflects historically a Johannine opinion that an early temple cleansing is wrong chronologically. Now, a lot of scholars say, oh, John put it early for theological reasons. Well, I think that Papias quotes John the Elder as saying, no, Mark is in the wrong order. The Last Supper was on a Thursday night. It was not a Passover meal, okay? And so you have these kinds of disagreements with Mark, to and from Jerusalem. So I think that you have a critique of earlier Mark in John. And then a second point is, well, Mark's not really historical, it's just speaking to the needs of the audiences, okay? Now, the needs of the audiences might be to be faithful to Christ when you're suffering persecution under Nero. And so that critique, though, is critique as license. If Mark's going to paraphrase Peter, or if Peter's going to paraphrase Jesus, we can paraphrase Jesus also and put Jesus in our own language. So it's critique as license. The third criticism is, well, Mark has a lot of duplications, like 2 feedings, 2 sea crossings, some similar teachings. Well, he made no mistake. He was just trying to leave nothing out. He was conservative, okay? So that reflects a criticism of duplication. So that suggests to me a 2nd century opinion that John is an improvement upon Mark in ways that account for some of those differences.
That's a very helpful thing to think about. Thank you. And Joy, it's your turn.
I'm really in the dark. This whole discussion is way over my head. And so I just want to have you explain something pretty simple that you're using a lot. What is Johannine?
Oh, Johannine is just an adjective.
Oh, Johannine. Okay.
It's pertaining
what does it mean?
Pertaining to John.
Pertaining to the gospel writer of John?
Pertaining to anything that relates to John.
Well, but I mean, you're talking about John being a whole bunch of different people. There's John the Elder, there's John the disciple, there's John the writer, gospel writer. Those are all different Johns.
So Johannine means it pertains to all that stuff. I mean, whoever the author was, we have 5 writings of John, including Revelation. The author claims to be John, but it's the most different. So Johannine, the Greek is Ioannes, okay, for the name John. So Johannine means pertaining to John in some way or another, whoever the person or the writings might have been.
That's an excellent question, Joy, because I think we do need to get ourselves straightened out as to who these different Johns are, how many they are, and maybe on that subject a little bit, Paul, can you tell us, like, what do you think of when you think of John the Elder? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Now the Greek there is presbyteros. So the elder is younger.
Now tell us what you mean by that.
The elder, as my Scottish friends would say, is a Presbyterian. So it's John the Presbyter. And so, again, according to Eusebius, John the Presbyter is the disciple of John the Apostle. And he's quoting Papias, who says that also, although Papias says a bunch of different things. He's got 5 volumes of his writings, and all we have are 17 fragments from Papias. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Helen, you want to chime in?
Well, let's say about John the Elder. I think that John the Elder is another leader in the call it the Johannine situation. Raymond Brown wrote a book in 79 on the community of the beloved disciple. I mean, I love Ray. I love his works. There was at least one community, okay? There probably was not only one community. There's probably a bunch of them. Now, I'm going to guess also that you have people worshiping in synagogues. This is after 70. So Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. But the temple is destroyed. According to Eusebius, John the Apostle leaves Jerusalem along with other people and goes to Asia Minor, goes to Ephesus. Okay, well, where are they going to worship? They're going to worship in the synagogue. But then you have second generation Pauline mission. So Pauline is pertaining to Paul. Okay, so you have house churches where believers in Jesus who are Gentile and some Jewish people are meeting in people's homes on first day, on Sunday. So probably people are meeting in Sabbath, in synagogue on Sabbath, and in house churches on first day. And so John the Elder is probably a leader among the house churches, at least one of them. And he's writing, the second John is written to the chosen lady and her children. And our people say hello to you from our church, okay? So you probably have different house churches that are meeting on Sundays, on first day. Those might include some Jewish people, and some Gentile believers in Jesus might be involved in local synagogue worship. So I'll call that the Johannine situation. You look at the book of Revelation 2 and 3, you have 7 churches around the region. And so you have, Sardis and Pergamum and Laodicea and Philadelphia. Says nothing about Boston, but anyway, you have, okay. So that's a circuit where a traveling preacher would go and read the letters of Christ to the churches described in Revelation 2 and 3. And so my guess is that some of the material that's in the letters, but also in the gospel, would be presented among the churches, by several people.
So, and just to follow up on the Johannine kind of idea, there are books that are not even in the Bible that are Johannine too, right?
Yes, although all of those are later. And so that's
later.
And so have some historical connection, or they could just be glomming on to somebody famous.
Okay, all right. Okay, so Helen, go ahead again.
But speaking of historical facts, I read somewhere that the beloved disciple seems to have a very keen and accurate impression of what the city of Jerusalem was like, much more so than the synoptic gospels. And that becomes intriguing to me in terms of the historicity of at least the situation there. So I just wanted to add that if you're looking for facts, that is something that scholars have noted.
Helen, you get a gold star right there. I've gathered together a book where I recruited essays from 24 top archaeologists in the world to write about archaeology in the Gospel of John. That's coming out next year with Erdman's. And so, Helen, here's a fact. Okay, I would be happy to believe there's nothing historical in John. It's all theological. I'd be happy to believe that. But the fact is, John has more mundane details and non-symbolic illustrative detail that is related to archaeological facts than all the other gospels put together, canonical and non-canonical. It's not my fault. I only read it.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do with that fact? So yeah, John is highly theological, but it also should be called the mundane gospel, not just the spiritual gospel. So now Helen, get this. There has never been a book ever written on archaeology in John. Albright wrote an essay on that, and Raymond Brown wrote another essay on Albright. So that piqued my interest. And so we're going to have a book that's going to have about 600 pages and over almost 100 photos of archaeological connections with the Gospel of John.
Fascinating.
I think that may open up the fourth quest.
Mm-hmm.
What's it going to be called?
It's called Archaeology, John, and Jesus. What recent discoveries show us about Jesus from the Gospel of John. And Craig Evans has written a response to all the essays. Now, okay, so Shirley, this is a part of the project that I've been helping with since 2002. It's called John, Jesus, and History. And this is the 9th volume in that series.
Okay.
And I'm gathering 4 more volumes for a total of 13, Lord willing, over the next 5 years. That'll be part of the central series of Jesus in the Johannine, Jesus remembered in the Johannine situation, Jesus remembered in the Johannine tradition, Jesus remembered among the Gospels, and then criteria for determining Johannine history. So these are volume 7 in the central series.
So did you just tell us about the next 5, or is that a summary of the whole series right now, what you just told us?
Those will be, okay, so we have 3 volumes right now in the central series published by SBL Press. And I'm gathering 4 more volumes that'll be a part of the central series. So volumes 4, 5, 6, and 7. And we have 6 other volumes that are just by other publishers. So the book coming out by Erdman's, that's just published by Erdman's, that's all.
Well, that's exciting. So you'll keep us posted then. We want to know about that as it's coming along.
Too.
Exciting. So actually, Helen, you have your hand up again. Do you have another comment?
I never put it down, but I just wanted to say, sorry, that John 6 is my favorite chapter in the whole Bible. And I was intrigued that you did your dissertation on it because I think it's the spiritual essence of the Eucharist. Yeah. And it's profound in my mind. It just means so much to me.
And I presented a paper on that on Saturday for the Pacific Northwest American Academy of Religion. And Helen, what I'm arguing is that the content, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, or you have no life in yourselves, it's not saying take the Eucharist or you have no salvation. It's saying if you deny Christ, who died on the cross for you and for us, don't expect to be raised up in the afterlife. So it's really a call to martyrological faithfulness. And so Bultmann argued that it's instrumentalist. So it's theophagy, the eating of the gods, the medicine of immortality, Ignatius. Therefore, it cannot have been written by the evangelism of Yada by the redactor. And I'm saying no. It is calling for solidarity with Jesus and his community. It's the way of the cross. That's the content. And therefore, it is central to the evangelist theology. It's not disparate from it.
What a fabulous coda for this wonderful conversation. That's beautiful. You have piqued our interest. Paul, I want to thank you on behalf of the whole group here for coming to be with us tonight. I know you've got like zillions of more presentations coming up just this year or in the summer ahead of you. And I just so appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. You've got all of us kind of interested in knowing not only more about John, but kind of where you're going with that 4th quest. Very interesting for us. But we got to say goodbye. And I imagine that people can continue the conversation with Paul on Facebook, on the Facebook conversations page. Any more questions you have, I'm sure Paul will be happy to finish up any little questions you may have. But we're going to bid adieu. Let me just close out here and thank everybody for your participation. This was the May 2023 textual study for the Bible and Beyond discussions titled Why the Gospel of John is Such a Surprise, with guest scholar Paul N. Anderson. Once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, we provide a discussion on a topic related to early Christian texts. We ask one of our knowledgeable scholars to share their knowledge and insights, and we provide time for participants to ask questions and share their own thoughts. And I expect you know that we do rely on your regular donations to be able to produce these textual studies. We want to especially thank those of you who have pledged your support on Patreon. You're the ones who keep us going. We want to thank you so much. It's been terrific.